Sport is an important part of the culture in Australia, with a long history in the country dating back to the pre-colonial period. Early sports that were played included cricket, Australian rules football, rugby union, horse racing and netball. Sport evolved with Australian national identity through events like Phar Lap, the Bodyline series and the America's Cup races. There are a number of professional sport leagues in Australia, including the Australian Football League, National Rugby League, Super Rugby, the A-League and W-League, ANZ Championship, the National Basketball League, the Women's National Basketball League and the Australian Baseball League Cricket Sheffield Shield. Attendance for some of these leagues over the course of a single season tops 6 million spectators in leagues such as the AFL, A-League and NRL. The media plays an important part in Australia's sporting landscape. Many sporting events are televised or are covered by the radio. The government has anti-siphoning laws to protect free-to-air stations. Beyond televising live events, there are many sport television shows, sport talk shows on the radio, magazines dedicated to sport and extensive newspaper coverage. Australian sport has also been the subject of Australian-made films such as The Club, Australian Rules, The Final Winter and Footy Legends. As a nation, Australia has competed in many international events including the Olympics and Paralympics, and the Commonwealth Games. The country has a large number of national teams in sports such as cricket, rugby union, rugby league, basketball, hockey, netball, soccer, softball, water polo and wheelchair rugby. Sport is played by different populations in Australia including women, people with disabilities and Australia's Indigenous people. History. Sport came to Australia in 1810 when the first athletics tournament was held. Soon after cricket, horse racing and sailing clubs and competitions started. Australia's lower classes would play sports on public holidays, with the upper classes playing more regularly on Saturdays. Sydney was the early hub of sport in the colony. Early forms of football were played there by 1829. Early sport in Australia was played along class lines. In 1835, the British Parliament banned blood sports except fox hunting in a law that was implemented in Australia. This was not taken well in the country as it was seen as an attack on the working classes. By the late 1830s, horse racing was established in New South Wales and other parts of the country, and enjoyed support across class lines. Gambling was part of sport from the time horse racing became an established sport in the colony. Horse racing was also happening in Melbourne at Batman's Hill in 1838, with the first race meeting in Victoria taking place in 1840. Cricket was also underway with the Melbourne Cricket Club founded in 1838. Sport was being used during the 1830s, 1840s and 1850s as a form of social integration across classes. Regular sport competitions were organised in New South Wales by 1850, with organised competition being played in Queensland and Victoria soon after. Victorian rules football was codified in 1859. Australian football clubs still around in the current Australian Football League were founded by 1858. The Melbourne Cricket Ground, Australia's largest sporting arena, opened in 1853. The Melbourne Cup was first run in 1861. A rugby union team was established at the University of Sydney in 1864. Regular sport did not begin to be played in South Australia, Tasmania and Western Australia until the late 1860s and early 1870s. The first Australian cricket team to go on tour internationally did so in 1868. The Australian side was an all-Aboriginal one and toured England where they played 47 games, where they won 14 games, drew 19 and lost 14. Australia's adoption of sport as a national pastime was so comprehensive that Anthony Trollope remarked in his book, Australia, published in 1870, "The English passion for the amusements which are technically called sports, is not a national necessity with the Americans, whereas with the Australians it is almost as much so as home." Soccer was being played in Australia by the 1870s, with the first team formally being organised in Sydney in 1880 that was named the Wanderers. Sport was receiving coverage in Australian newspapers by 1876 when a sculling race in England was reported on in the Sydney Morning Herald. In 1877, Australia played in the first Test cricket match against England. In 1882, the Ashes were started following the victory of the Australian national cricket team over England. Field hockey teams for men and women were established by 1890. The Sheffield Shield cricket competition was first held in 1891 with New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia participating in the inaugural competition. The remaining states would not participate until much later, with Queensland first participating in 1926 a Euro 27, Western Australia in 1947 a Euro 48 and Tasmania in 1982 a Euro 83. In 1897 the Victorian Football League, which later became the AFL, the Australian Football League, was founded after breaking away from the Victorian Football Association. The first badminton competition in Australia was played in 1900. The first ice hockey game was played in Melbourne on July 12, 1906 between a local Melbourne team and a team from the crew of the visiting U.S. warship USS Baltimore. When Messenger and the All Golds returned from Great Britain in 1908, they helped the new clubs adapt to the rules of Rugby League prior to the inaugural 1908 NSWRFL season. The Queensland Rugby Football League also formed early in 1908 by 7 rugby players who were dissatisfied with the administration of the Queensland Rugby Union. The Australian National Rugby Union team had their first international test against New Zealand in 1903, and first international tour in 1908, earning their nickname of the Wallabies after 2 British journalists used it to refer to the team. The team won gold at the 1908 London Olympics. However, the majority of the squad joined rugby league clubs upon returning to Australia. Women represented Australia for the first time at the Olympics in 1912. Surfing came to Australia by 1915 with the first surf life-saving competition being held that year. Les Darcy began his boxing career in 1915, with some of his later fights taking place at Sydney Stadium. The following year, an American promoter encouraged Darcy to go to the United States at a time when Australia was actively recruiting young men for the armed services. Controversy resulted and Darcy died at the age of 21 in the United States. When his body was returned to Australia, 100,000 people attended his Sydney funeral. Darcy would remain significant to Australians into the 2000s, when Kevin Rudd mentioned his story. In 1922, a committee in Australia investigated the benefits of physical education for girls. They came up with several recommendations regarding what sports were and were not appropriate for girls to play based on the level of fitness required. It was determined that for some individual girls that for medical reasons, the girls should probably not be allowed to participate in tennis, netball, lacrosse, golf, hockey, and cricket. Football was completely medically inappropriate for girls to play. It was medically appropriate for all girls to be able to participate in, so long as they were not done in an overly competitive manner, swimming, rowing, cycling and horseback riding. Dick Eve won Australia's first Olympic diving gold medal in 1924. In 1924 the Australian Rugby League Board of Control, later to be known as the Australian Rugby League, was formed to administer the national team, and later as the national governing body for the sport of rugby league. In 1928 the team also adopted the national colours of green and gold for the first time, having previously used blue and maroon, making the Kangaroos the third national sporting body to do so after cricket and the Australian Olympic team. Netball Australia was founded in 1927 as the All Australia Women's Basketball Association. During the 1930s, the playing of sport on Sunday was banned in most countries outside South Australia. During the 1930s, Rugby League, which had gone professional, began to overtake rugby union in popularity in Queensland, with the league being the dominant spectator code by 1937. The Bodyline cricket series between Australia and England took place in 1932 a Euro 33. The English side were very determined to win, using physical intimidation against Australia to ensure it. The bowling style used by the team, known Bodyline bowling, was devised by Douglas Jardine with advice from Frank Foster in England ahead of the series in order to defeat Australian batsman Donald Bradman. Going into the start of the series, Belvoce told the media, "If we don't beat you, we'll knock your bloody heads off." The style of play was such that the Australians contemplated cancelling the series after the Adelaide Test. Following a successful Australian racing career, the racehorse Phar Lap went to the United States where he died. There were many conspiracy theories at the time and later that suggested people in the United States poisoned the horse to prevent him from winning. Australian women's sports had an advantage over many other women's sport organisations around the world in the period after World War II. Women's sports organisations had largely remained intact and were holding competitions during the war period. This structure survived in the post-war period. Women's sport were not hurt because of food rationing, petrol rationing, population disbursement, and other issues facing post-war Europe. In September 1949, Australian canoeing is founded as the Australian Canoe Federation. By the 1960s, Australia had an international identity as a sport-obsessed country, an identity which was embraced inside the country. This was so well known that in a 1962 edition of Sports Illustrated, Australia was named the most sports-obsessed country in the world. In 1967, Australia hosted the second World Netball Championships in Perth. That same year, South Australia became the last state to lift its ban on the playing of sports on Sunday. Starting in the early 1970s, Australian sport underwent a paradigm shift with sponsorship becoming one of the fundamental drivers of earnings for Australian sport on amateur and professional levels. By the mid-1980s, the need for the ability to acquire sponsorship dollars in sport was so great that job applicants for sport administrator positions were expected to be able to demonstrate an ability to get it. During the 1970s, Australia was being routinely defeated in major international competitions as Eastern Bloc countries enjoyed strong government support for sport. The Liberal governments at the time were opposed to similar intervention in Australia's sporting system as they felt it would be government intrusion into an important component of Australian life. In the 1974 elections, several Australian sporting competitors endorsed the Liberal Party in advertisements that ran on television. Competitors involved included Ron Barassi, NSWRL player Johnny Raper and horse trainer Tommy Smith. That year, the Australian team qualified for the 1974 FIFA World Cup, the first successful qualification to the FIFA World Cup in the country's history after failing to qualify to the 1966 and 1970 tournaments. It would prove to be the only appearance for the Australian team for more than 3 decades. The regional football code divide in Australia was still present in the 1980s, with Rugby League being the dominant code in Queensland and New South Wales while Australian rules football dominated in the rest of the country. When codes went outside of their traditional geographic home, they had little success in gaining new fans and participants. The Australian Institute of Sport was founded in 1981. In the lead-up to and during the 1982 Commonwealth Games, the police were called upon to stop protests by Aboriginal land rights activists who staged protests timed with the event in order to politicise the event. Australia had competitors in the America's Cup yacht race for a number of years. Going into the 1983 race, the Australian media was not that interested in the race as they expected a similar result, and in the media led up to the event, made it out to be a race for rich people. This lack of interest continued throughout the early races. Near the end, when Australia finally appeared poised to win it, millions of Australians turned on their television to watch the Australia to win the competition. That year, the Liberals used Australian tennis star John Newcombe and race car drivers Peter Brock and Alan Jones in their political advertising. Athletes would again be used, this time by the Labour Party, in the 1989 elections. During the 1980s, Australian soccer players began to start playing regularly in overseas professional leagues, with the most successful player of the decade being Craig Johnston, who scored a goal in the 1986 FA Cup final for Liverpool. During the 1980s, the federal government created a number of sport programs including Aussie Sports and Active Australia. The Australia women's national field hockey team began their run as one of the top teams in the world in 1985. A place they would hold until 2000. In 1990, the Victorian Football League changed its name to the Australian Football League. During the 1990s, Soccer in Australia faced a challenge in attracting youth players because of the ethnic nature of the sport at the highest levels of national competition. The sport's governing body made an effort to make the game less ethnically oriented. At the same time, rival football codes were intentionally trying to bring in ethnic participants in order to expand their youth playing base. Doping became a concern during the 1980s and more active steps were taken to combat it in Australia in the early 1990s. In 1990, the Australian Sports Drug Agency Act 1990 was passed and took control of doping test away from the Australian Sport Commission and put it into the hands of an independent doping control agency as of February 17, 1991. In 2002, the Australian government again intervened in sport when Senator Rod Kemp, the Minister for Arts and Sport, announced that Soccer Australia was to be restructured by the Australian Sports Commission. At the time, the organisation had $2.6 million Australian dollars in debt. National organisational problems were mirrored on the state level at the time of the takeover. The Australian Sports Commission delivered back a report that recommended 53 changes to be made in 4 key areas. One suggestion involved separating the management of the national governing body from that of the National League. Former Australian Rugby Union CEO John Unnall was brought in to make these changes and the organisation changed its name in 2005 to Football Federation Australia as part of an effort to reposition the sport in the country. In 2006, Melbourne hosted the 2006 Commonwealth Games. Later that year, the Australian team competed in the 2006 FIFA World Cup, their second FIFA World Cup appearance after 32 years of failing to qualify for the tournament. In 2010, the Rugby League club Melbourne Storm were found to have been systematically breaching the NRL salary cap rules over 5 years. The club was fined a record Australian sporting fine of $1,689,000, stripped of 2 premierships and 3 minor premierships, and prevented from accumulating any premiership points in the 2010 NRL season. In 2012, the Australian Rugby League Commission was formed, bringing to an end the involvement of News Limited in the administration of Rugby League and the media company's conflict of interests in the sport, finally concluding the fallout from the Super League war in the 1990s. From 2008 until 2013, the Australian thoroughbred mare Black Caviar was undefeated in 25 races, a record not equalled in over 100 years. Notable wins include the 2012 Diamond Jubilee Stakes, as well as being named the top sprinter from 2010 to 2012 in the World Thoroughbred Racehorse Rankings and entering the Australian Racing Hall of Fame. Organisation. The organisation of sport in Australia has been largely determined by its federal system of government, a Euro-Australian government and 6 states and 2 territories governments and local governments. State and territory governments have a department with responsibility for sport and recreation. These departments provide assistance to state sports organisations, develop and manage sporting facilities, provide financial assistance for major sporting events and develop policies to assist sports across their state or territory. Each Australian state and territory has established its own Institute Academy of Sport, a Euro-ACT Academy of Sport, New South Wales Institute of Sport, Northern Territory Institute of Sport, Queensland Academy of Sport, South Australian Sports Institute, Tasmanian Institute of Sport, Victorian Institute of Sport and Western Australian Institute of Sport. There are 560 local councils across Australia. Local governments generally focus on the provision of facilities such as swimming pools, sporting fields, stadiums and tennis courts. Government involvement in sport up until the 1970s was fairly limited, with local governments playing a major role through the provision of sporting facilities. However, this changed over the next 2 decades with an Australian Bureau of Statistics survey in 2001, a Euro 2002 finding that approximately $2 billion was spent on sport by 3 levels of government, 10% from the Australian government, 40% from state and territory governments, and the remaining 50% from local government. State, territory and local government spending was predominantly directed to facilities and their upkeep. In 1973, The Recreation Ministers' Council was established to provide a forum for Australian government and state and territory ministers responsible for sport and recreation to discuss matters of interest. With governments taking an increased involvement in sport, it became the Sport and Recreation Ministers' Council. More recently is referred to as Meeting of Sport and Recreation Ministers. The meeting is assisted by the Committee of Australian Sport and Recreation Officials, previously called the Standing Committee on Sport and Recreation. The meeting works cooperatively on issues such as match fixing, sport participation and water safety. In 2011, ministers signed the National Sport and Active Recreation Policy Framework. The framework provides a mechanism for the achievement of national goals for sport and active recreation, sets out agreed roles and responsibilities of governments and their expectations of sport and active recreation partners. In 1993, National Elite Sports Council was established to provide a forum for communication, issues management and national program coordination across the high performance in Australia. It includes representatives from AIS, state institutes/academies, Australian Olympic Committee, Australian Paralympic Committee, and the Australian Commonwealth Games Association. In 2011, National Institute System Intergovernmental Agreement provides guidance on how the sector will operate, with a principal focus on the delivery of the high-performance plans of national sporting organisations. The Australian government provided small amounts of funding in the 1950s and 1960s through the support of the National Fitness Council and international sporting teams such as the Australian Olympic team. The Australian government's serious involvement and investment into sport came with it establishing the Australian Institute of Sport in 1981. AIS was set up to improve Australia's performances in international sport, which had started to decline in the 1960s and 1970s, culminating in Australia winning no gold medals at the 1976 Montreal Olympics. In 1985, the Australian Sports Commission was established to improve the Australian government's administration of sport in terms of funding, participation and elite sport. The 1989 Senate inquiry into drugs in sport resulted in the establishment of the Australian Sport Drug Agency, in 1990 to manage Australia's anti-doping program. Participation. The highest rates of participation for Australian sport and recreation are informal, non-organised sports, with bike riding, skateboarding, rollerblading or riding a scooter topping the list of activities for children, with 66% of all boys bike riding and 55.9% of all boys skateboarding, rollerblading or riding a scooter in 2009 and 2010. Girls also participated in these activities at high rates, with 54.4% of them doing bike riding and 42.4% skateboarding, rollerblading or riding a scooter. Other sports popular for Australian girls include dancing, which had 26.3% participation, swimming with 19.8% participation and netball at 17%. For boys, the other popular sports for participation included soccer with a rate of participation of 19.9%, swimming with a participation rate of 17.2%, Australian rules at 16%. Participation rates for adults in Australia were much lower than that of Australian children. For adult women in Australia, the number one sport activity they participate in is walking, with 30% having done this in 2009 and 2010. The second most popular form of exercise and sport was aerobics gym with a rate of 16.7%. The third most popular for adult women was swimming and diving with 8.4%. For men, the most popular sport activity was also walking with a participation rate of 15.6%. This was followed by aerobics gym with 11.2%. The third most popular sport for adult males was cycling BMX-ing with a participation rate of 8.2%. There are 34,000 athletes, officials and coaches currently registered with the Athletics Australia. A 2007 estimate claimed that Australian football had 615,549 participants. Basketball has become one of the most popular participation sports in Australia. In Victoria, and Melbourne, particularly, it has more participants than any other sport. Australia's warm climate and long coastline of sandy beaches and rolling waves provide ideal conditions for water sports such as swimming. The majority of Australians live in cities or towns on or near the coast, and so beaches are a place that millions of Australians visit regularly. Amateur sport. Amateur sport in Australia follows a corporate management system, with the national tier composed of national sport organisations that support and fund elite sport development. These organisations include the Australian Institute of Sport and the Australian Sports Commission. Below them is the state level, which includes state sporting organisations, State Institute of Sport and state departments of sport. The last level is district regional associations and local clubs and community sports along with local government. At the national level, the national sport organisations govern most sports in Australia, with over 120 different national sports organisations overseeing sport in Australia. The role of government in this structure is important as government funding for most sport in Australia comes from the national government, state and territory governments, and local governments. In the late 1990s, government support for sport was double that of public non-financial corporations. Amateur sport was transformed in Australia in the 1980s with the creation of the Australian Institute of Sport. The institute, formally opened by Malcolm Fraser in 1981, was designed to make Australian amateur sport at major world competitions, like the Olympics, competitive with the rest of the world and increase the number of medals won by the country. A few years later, in 1984, the Australian Sports Commission was created to better address the distribution of funds to support sport. It had a budget of $109 million in 2000. By 2009, the Australian Sports Commission had a budget of $150 million, up from $5 million when it first was created. Amateur sport has been able to draw large audiences. In the 1950s, 120,000 fans would go to the MCG to watch major athletics events. In 2000, during the soccer gold medal match between Cameroon and Spain, 114,000 fans watched the game live inside Stadium Australia. Australian amateur sport has dealt with financial problems. In the 2000s, Athletics Australia was facing dual problems of financial problems and failure for the sport to consistently medal at major international sporting events compared to other sports and their representative organisations like Swimming Australia and Rowing Australia. Professional sport. Professional sport leagues in Australia include the Australian Football League, the National Rugby League, the A-League soccer competition, and the National Basketball League. Unlike in Europe and the United States, professional clubs tend to be member-run organisations instead of single-owner, for-profit businesses. Australian professional sport generates over $10 billion in revenue. The major football codes and professional leagues in the country all watch what their competition does in order to improve their own strategic picture in the Australian sporting landscape. Revenues for professional sport comes from three primary streams including sponsorship and television rights. In 2007, the Australian Football League had the greatest financial stability of all the leagues in Australia with turnover of $280 million, with the National Rugby League coming in second with $120 million. At the same time, the AFL had highest level of corporate support with major national and international sponsors such as Air Emirates, Vodafone and Toyota. The AFL also beat the NRL in terms of geographic spread of their teams, with the AFL having teams in 5 states while the NRL had teams in 3 states and a territory in 2007. In 2007, the AFL was also spending $30 million in youth player development compared to the NRL's $15 million. The National Rugby League traces its roots back to the 1890s when Rugby League split from Rugby Union as the code went professional. By 1908, the professional New South Wales Rugby League was created. Collective player bargaining came to the professional game by 1982, with 95% of all played having joined the player union by 1991. Media access to the sport was one of the main reasons for a split in the sport in the 1990s that resulted in the New South Wales Rugby League facing competition from the Rupert Murdoch-backed Super League, and the Super League War in 1997, which ended with the founding of the National Rugby League, which had become a national, not state-based, professional competition. In rugby union, state teams have been playing each other since the late 19th century, but became professional only in 1996. Since then, the Wallabies national team has played in the annual Rugby Championship, originally known as the Tri-Nations Series. The competition has included the All Blacks and Springboks since its creation, and since 2012 has also involved the Argentina Pumas. The Wallabies have won 3 editions. Meanwhile, there are 5 Australia franchise teams in Super Rugby, which also features provincial teams from New Zealand and South Africa. The ACT Brumbies have won the competition twice, and the Queensland Reds and NSW Orators have each won once. Australia has yet to establish a professional level beneath Super Rugby for a sustained period of time. The Australian Rugby Union launched the Australian Rugby Championship in 2007, but it lasted only 1 season due to major financial losses. The ARU launched a second attempt at a domestic professional league, the National Rugby Championship, in 2014. The National Basketball League was formed in 1978 and is Australia's top professional basketball competition. In its most recently completed season in 2013, a Euro 14, it had 7 teams in the country, plus 1 team in New Zealand. One of the purposes of the league is to provide a system to provide players to feed into the Australian men's national basketball team. The Australian Football League saw money pour into the sport during the 1990s and 2000s. In 1993, total player payments were $24 million Australian dollars but reached $95 million Australian dollars by 2003. Spectatorship. Australian sport fans have historically attended events in large numbers, dating back to the country's early history. An early football game played in Melbourne in 1858 had 2,000 spectators. By 1897, tens of thousands of spectators attended an early Australian rules football match at a time when top-level soccer matches in England would draw 6,000 fans. A finals match between the Carlton Football Club and Collingwood in 1938 drew 96,834 fans. In 1909, at a time when rugby union had not yet become professionalised, 52,000 people in Sydney attended a game between New South Wales and New Zealand. The spectators accounted for 10% of the total population of Sydney at the time. A world record was set for cricket attendance on December 30, 1932, when 63,993 fans watched England take on Australia at the Melbourne Cricket Ground. Total average game attendance for the Australian Football League and the National Rugby League increased between 1970 and 2000, with the AFL going from an average attendance of 24,344 people per match in 1970 to 27,325 by 1980 to 25,238 in 1990 and 34,094 by 2000. The National Rugby League had an average per game attendance of 11,990 in 1970, saw a decrease in 1980 to 10,860 but increased to 12,073 by 1990 and improved on that to 14,043 by 2000. Founded later, the National Basketball League had an average per game attendance of 1,158 in 1985, increased this to 4,551 by 1990, and kept attendance steady with 4,636 average fans per game in 2000. In March 1999, 104,000 fans attended a double-header match in the National Rugby League at Stadium Australia 4 days after the venue formally opened. In the 2006 Euro 07 season, the A-League Melbourne Victory averaged 27,728 people to their home matches throughout the season. The 2009 Euro 10 regular season was considerably lower. In 2011, the Australian Football League had a cumulative attendance of 7,139,272, a record for the competition, and an average attendance of 36,425. In 2010, the National Rugby League's Premiership set a record for regular season attendance to NRL matches. Sports media coverage of Australian sport and athletes predates 1876. The first all-Australian sport publication, The Referee, was first published in 1886 in Sydney. The major newspapers for sport coverage in the country include the Herald Sun and the West Australian. There is a long history of television coverage of sports in Australia. From 1957 to 2001, the Seven Network was the network for the Australian Football League. The only year that Seven was not the network for the league was in 1987 when the AFL was on the ABC. An exclusive deal was agreed upon by Seven in 1976 for a 5-year deal worth $3 million Australian dollars. Not all sports have had favourable deals with network. The first television offer for the National Basketball League was worth $1 Australian in an offer made by Seven that the league accepted. The deal made by Ten Network to the New South Wales Rugby League was worth considerably more, worth $48 million Australian for a 5-year deal that also included broadcasting rights for the state of origin and the Australian National Rugby League team. This deal was terminated early because the network could not afford to pay out. The 1967 NSWRFL season's grand final became the first football grand final of any code to be televised live in Australia. The Nine Network had paid $5,000 for the broadcasting rights. SBS and Fox Sports are two of the most important television networks in Australia in terms of covering all Australian sports, not just the popular professional leagues. Administrators for less popular spectator sports, such as basketball and netball, believe that getting additional television and newspaper coverage is fundamental for the growth and success of their sports going forward. Anti-Siphoning Laws in Australia regulate the media companies' access to significant sporting events. In 1992, when the country experienced growth in paid subscription media, the Parliament of Australia enacted the Broadcasting Services Act that gave free-to-air broadcasters preferential access to acquire broadcasting rights to sporting events. The Anti-Siphoning List is a list of major sporting events that the Parliament of Australia has decided must be available for all Australians to see free of charge and cannot be siphoned off to pay TV where people are forced to pay to see them. The current Anti-Siphoning List came into effect in 2006 and expires December 31, 2010. The Minister for Communications can add or remove events from the list at his discretion. There are currently 10 sports on the Anti-Siphoning List plus the Olympic and Commonwealth Games. Events on the Anti-Siphoning List are delisted 12 weeks before they start to ensure pay TV broadcasters have reasonable access to listed events, if free-to-air broadcasters decide not to purchase the broadcast rights for a particular event. Any rights to listed sporting events that are not acquired by free-to-air broadcasters are available to pay TV. For multi-round events where it is simply not possible for free-to-air networks to broadcast all matches within the event, complimentary coverage is available on pay television. The federal government is obliged by legislation to conduct a review of the list before the end of 2009. The current Anti-Siphoning List requires showing listed sports on the broadcaster's main channel. Rugby League, which includes NRL, State of Origin and national team matches, had the highest aggregate television ratings of any sport in 2009 and 2010. Also, in a world first, the Nine Network broadcast free-to-air the first match of the 2010 State of Origin series live in 3D in New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria. There are a number of Australian sport films. They include The Club. The film was based on a play produced in 1977, in Melbourne. It has been in the senior English syllabi for 4 Australian states for many years. The film was written by David Williamson, directed by Bruce Beresford and starring John Howard, Jack Thompson, Graham Kennedy and Frank Wilson. Another Australian sport film is The Final Winter, released in 2007. It was directed by Brian Andrews and Jane Forrest and produced by Anthony Coffey and Michelle Russell, while independently produced it is being distributed by Paramount Pictures. It was written by Matthew Nable, who also starred as the lead role Grub Henderson. The film, which earned praise from critics, focuses around Grub, who is the captain of the Newtown Jets football team in the early 1980s and his determination to stand for what rugby league traditionally stood for while dealing with his own identity crisis. Other Australian sport films include Australian Rules and Footy Legends. Sport is popular on the radio. This Sporting Life was a culturally iconic Triple J radio comedy program, created by award-winning actor-writer-comedians John Doyle and Greg Pickhaver, who performed as their characters Roy and H.G. Broadcast from 1986 to 2008, it was one of the longest-running, most popular and most successful radio comedy programs of the post-television era in Australia. It was the longest-running show in Triple J's programming history, and commanded a large and dedicated nationwide audience throughout its 22-year run. 2KY is a commercial radio station based in Sydney, broadcasting throughout New South Wales and Canberra on a network of over 140 narrow-cast transmitters as well as the main 1017 AM frequency in Sydney. 2KY broadcasts live commentary of thoroughbred, harness and greyhound racing. Over 1,500 races are covered each week, including the pre- and post-race form and TAB betting information. There are a number of Australian sport magazines. One is the AFL Record. The magazine is published in a sports magazine-style format. 8 different versions, one for each game, are published for each weekly round, 60,000 copies in total, and Roy Morgan Research estimates that the Record has a weekly readership of over 200,000. As of 2009, the week's records are published and are able to be viewed in an online magazine format. Another Australian sporting magazine is Australia's Surfing Life, a monthly magazine about surfing published in Australia. It features articles about surf trips in Australia and overseas, surfing technique, board design and wetsuits. The magazine was founded in 1985. International competitions. The 1868 Aboriginal Cricket Tour of England was the first tour by any sports team from Australia. Then Australia has participated in and also hosted a number of major international sporting events including the 1956 Summer Olympics, the 2000 Summer Olympics. The country also regularly hosts a major tennis Grand Slam event, a Formula One World Championship round and motorcycle MotoGP round, alongside major domestically created, internationally recognised events including the Melbourne Cup and the Sydney to Hobart Yacht Race. Australia also hosted the 2003 Rugby World Cup, with the event generating around $1 billion Australian dollars in economic activity while bringing in 2 million visitors to the country. Australia has also hosted the 1992 Cricket World Cup, and will also host the 2015 edition. The Australian national cricket team have participated in every edition of the Cricket World Cup. Australia have been very successful in the event, winning the tournament 4 times, the record amount. Australia's women have repeatedly won at the highest level. During the 1990s, the Australian national netball team, Australia women's national field hockey team and Australia women's national cricket team won world championships. The Socceroos have appeared at the FIFA World Cup in 1974, 2006, 2010 and 2014. At the 2006 FIFA World Cup, the Socceroos surprised many by reaching the round of 16, losing 1-0 in injury time to the eventual champions Italy. Olympics. The Olympic movement in Australia started out during the 1900s and 1910s in Australia. The first organisations for the Olympics in Australia came out of the athletics governance system and resulted in the creation of state-based Olympic committees. The first national governing body for Australian Olympics was created in 1914 and was a joint effort with New Zealand, though New Zealand was a less than able partner. The movement in Australia then stagnated as a result of the Great War. The New Zealand and Australian organisation was disbanded and an Australian-only national organisation was founded in 1920 called the Australian Olympic Federation. The early goals of the organisation were to ratify teams' selection and to fundraise to assist Olympians in paying for their travel to compete at the Games. By the 1980s, the organisation had issues on the international level as the IOC wanted them to restructure. Until this time, the organisation followed governance models similar to that of other Australian sporting organisations with a federated model of governance. Changes were made. The organisation ended up with an executive board with a president, 2 vice presidents, a secretary-general and a 14-member executive board which had 10 elected members, 4 IOC members and 2 members of the Athletes' Commission. Australia has hosted the Olympics twice, in 1956 in Melbourne and in 2000 in Sydney. These were the first games hosted in the Southern Hemisphere. Australia has been active influential in the Olympic movement, with 4 Australian representatives who are members of the International Olympic Committee. The government has provided monetary support for the Olympics. In the lead-up to the 1924 Games, they provided £3,000 and in 1936 provided £2,000. This support was seen as a way of supporting national identity, but no formal system existed for the funding wider sport at the time. The 1956 Games were the first time Australia had an equestrian competitor when Victorian Annie Barker competed. Australia has generally been a world power in Olympic swimming since the 1956 Melbourne Olympics. Swimmers like Shane Gould, Dawn Fraser, Ian Thorpe and Kieran Perkins have taken multiple gold medals. Australia performed relatively poorly at the 1976 Summer Olympics. This upset the nation as it challenged a fundamental part of Australian identity. The following Olympics, the 1980 Summer Olympics, some Australian sports sat out as part of a boycott and the country earned only 9 medals, 2 of them gold, in Moscow. To prevent a recurrence of this, the Australian Institute of Sport was created to help improve Australia's medal tally at the Games. Channel 7 had exclusive Australian free-to-air, pay television, online and mobile telephony broadcast rights to the 2008 Summer Olympics in Beijing. The live telecast of the 2008 Summer Olympics was shared by the 7 Network and SBS Television. 7 broadcast the opening and closing ceremonies and mainstream sports including swimming, athletics, rowing, cycling and gymnastics. In contrast, SBS TV provided complementary coverage focused on long-form events such as football, road cycling, volleyball, and table tennis. Paralympics. Australia has attended every Summer Paralympics and hosted the 2000 Sydney Games. Australia sent a delegation of 170 athletes to compete at the 2008 Summer Paralympics in Beijing, and a team of 11 competitors to compete in 2 disciplines at the 2010 Winter Paralympics in Vancouver, Canada. A team of 161 members was sent to the 2012 Summer Paralympics in London. Commonwealth Games. Australians take the Commonwealth Games very seriously as a nation because, on one level of national thinking, the event offers the country an opportunity to prove they are superior to the original country, the United Kingdom. By the 1938 British Empire Games, Australia's combined medal total was already greater than that of the home nation's tallies combined. Australia would go on to beat England in total medals at the Commonwealth Games at the 1950, 1962, 1970, 1974 and 1982 Commonwealth Games. This rivalry with England continues to be an important component of the Games for the country. By the 1938 British Empire Games, Australia's combined medal total was already greater than that of the home nation's tallies combined. Australia would go on to beat England in total medals at the Commonwealth Games at the 1950, 1962, 1970, 1974 and 1982 Commonwealth Games. See also, disabled sport in Australia, golf in Australia, motorsport in Australia, surfing in Australia, tennis in Australia, winter sport in Australia, women's sport in Australia, Australian national sports team nicknames, Aussie Aussie Aussie, Oi Oi Oi, list of sports museums and halls of fame in Australia, list of Australian sports controversies, references. Bibliography, Adair, Darrell. Vampelue, Ray. Sport in Australian History. Melbourne, Oxford University Press. ISBN A978-0-19-553590-7. OCLCA 37217245 All England Netball Association. Netball. ANC Black. ISBN A978-0-7136-7697-6 Andreff, Vladimir. Simaski, Stefan. Handbook on the Economics of Sport. Edward Elgar Publishing. ISBN A978-1-84376-608-7. Retrieved September 18, 2012. Andrews, Malcolm. The Encyclopedia of Australian Sports. Sydney, Golden Press. ISBN A0-85558-849-7. OCLCA 21526949. Bloomfield, John. Australia's Sporting Success, The Inside Story. UNSW Press. ISBN A978-0-86840-582-7. Bale, John. Running Cultures, Racing in Time and Space. Taylor and Francis. ISBN A978-0-7146-5535-2. Bennett, Tony. Carter, David. Culture in Australia, Policies, Publics and Programmes. Cambridge University Press. ISBN A978-0-521-00403-9. Boy Scouts of America, Incorporated. Boys Life. Boy Scouts of America, Incorporated. ISNA 0006-8608. Clark, Manning. A History of Australia. Melbourne University Publish. ISBN A978-0-522-84523-5. Collins, Felicity. Davis, Therese. Australian Cinema After Mabo. Cambridge University Press. ISBN A978-0-521-54256-2. Retrieved October 3, 2012. Krigo, Robert. Sports and Games of the 18th and 19th Centuries. Greenwood Publishing Group. ISBN A978-0-313-31610-4. Crotty, Martin. Roberts, David. Turning Points in Australian History. UNSW Press. ISBN A978-1-921410-56-7. Retrieved October 2, 2012. Fort, Rodney D. Fizzle, John. International Sports Economics Comparisons. Greenwood Publishing Group. ISBN A978-0-275-98032-0. Gutman, Alon. Sports, The First Five Millennia. University of Massachusetts Press. ISBN A978-1-55849-610-1. Hyam, James. Sport Tourism Destinations. Routledge. ISBN A978-0-7506-5937-6. Hoai, Russell. Nicholson, Matthew. Westerbeek, Hans. Smith, Aaron. Stewart, Bob. Sport Management. Routledge. ISBN A978-0-7506-8755-3. McKay, Jim. No Pain, No Gain? A Sport in Australian Culture. New York, Prentice Hall. ISBN A978-0-7248-1080-2. OCLCA 24408455. Majumdar, Rammohan. History of Physical Education and Sports. Pinnacle Technology. ISBN A978-1-61820-459-2. Norright, John. Parrish, Charles. Sports Around the World, History, Culture, and Practice. ABC Clio. ISBN A978-1-59884-300-2. RIC Publications. Primary Australian History. RIC Publications. ISBN A978-1-74126-684-9. Rolls, Eric C. Halligan, Marion. Matthews, Marlene. Cliff, Paul. A Sporting Nationalist Celebrating Australia's Sporting Life. Canberra, National Library of Australia. ISBN A0-642-10704-1. OCLCA 44839640. Shilbury, David. Dean, John. Sport Management in Australia, an Organisational Overview. Bentley East, Victoria, Strategic Sport Management. ISBN A978-0-9580170-0-8. OCLCA 777321324. Smith, Holly. Melbourne, Victoria and Tasmania. Hunter Publishing, Incorporated. ISBN A978-1-58843-779-2. Stewart, Bob. Australian Sport a Euro Better by Design? The Evolution of Australian Sport Policy. Taylor and Francis. ISBN A978-0-415-34046-5. Hess, Rob. Nicholson, Matthew. Stewart, Bob. De Moore, Gregory. A National Gamea, The History of Australian Rules Football. Camberwell, Victoria, Penguin. ISBN A978-0-670-07089-3. OCLCA 247974138. External links: Australian Sports Commission, Australian Institute of Sport.